Everyone. I am going to set a timer on my on my watch, because notoriously my classes go for 3 hours and I've lost the art of knowing how long 20 minutes is. So let me just do that and that'll keep me accountable. So as Greg said, my name is Sophie. I am, and it is a very long title, the Head of Undergraduate Studies for the Faculty of Ministry Practice at Tabor. Basically, it means that I look after our Bachelor of Ministry, Bachelor of Theology, Diploma of Ministry and Theology students, and I'm the primary New Testament lecturer. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a summary of what we talked about yesterday. It comes out of a subject that I teach at Tabor called The Biblical Story for Everyone. In 13 weeks, we do an overview from Genesis to Revelation, and it's a lot to pack into 13 weeks. It's a lot to try and pack into 3 hours yesterday, and it's even more to try and pack into 15, 20 minutes today, so we'll see how we go. I want to tell you a story about something that happened to me when I was growing up. So I was 14, and I was in the back of one of my best friend's cars with her, and her mum was driving us somewhere. And I had been newly Christian for maybe a year. So grew up going to Sunday school, but around 13, faith became real to me, Jesus became real. And so I'd been a Christian for about a year, and I'd invited my friend, who was in the car with me, along to youth group. Her family wasn't Christian, and I don't know in hindsight that her mum was particularly happy that I was inviting her to come to youth with me, because that day, the mum's driving, going down the road, she looks in the rear vision mirror and she says to me, "How can you believe in a God who asks his people to commit genocide?" I was 14. I had been Christian for a year. I didn't even know what genocide meant. I didn't know how to answer that question. Ironically, at the time, I used to wear a pendant around my neck that had Joshua 1:9 on it, that said, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And I thought, that's an amazing promise for me. Little did I know that Joshua was the one who would end up in the conquest narratives going into other nations and taking over their land. And so I had this beautiful pendant necklace of a promise to God for me, and then my friend's mum was saying, "How can you believe in a God that would tell Joshua to be strong and courageous to go and take the land?" I didn't know what to do with that, and that question has stayed with me my entire adult life, and I still wrestle with it sometimes to this day. But what I realised as I reflected on that is I had, in my mind, separated the Bible out into different categories. I had separated it out into the stories that I learned in Sunday school, so Jonah and the whale, Noah and the ark, David and Goliath, Daniel and the lion's den. It was always a character and something else to make a really good story, Daniel and the lion's den. And so I'd been taught all of these stories as kids. I'd heard stories about Jesus doing miraculous things, Jesus' death and resurrection for the forgiveness of my sins, all wonderful stories. But I realised that there was a lot of the Bible that I didn't understand and that I simply didn't know. And so I had some good moral teaching from the stories in the Old Testament. I had a good understanding of what Jesus had done for me. But then I started to read the Bible from start to finish, and I got to about the middle of Exodus, and I was like, what are these instructions about tabernacles and lengths of pieces of cloth and the particular colours that they have to be? It was confusing to me. And so I think maybe your upbringing was different to this. Maybe someone gave you a really good overview of the Bible. But in my mind, I'd separated it out into different pieces. So stories went over here, the weird stuff I didn't understand went over here, the beautiful promises that I absolutely adored stayed close to my heart. And I think if I'm really honest, there was a locked box that I kept tucked away where I couldn't see it, of passages that if someone had have asked me about them, I would have been embarrassed that they were in the Bible. I just didn't know what to do with them. And so it wasn't until coming to study at Tabor and coming to teach at Tabor that I realised there's actually some really helpful frameworks for understanding how the whole story of the Bible fits together. So that's what we were talking about yesterday. The idea comes from a book called The Drama of Scripture by Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen. And they make the case that the Bible is a big story from start to finish, and that it is one cohesive narrative. Now, it's a complicated, long, and messy narrative, but it is one that we can actually get our heads around. And so that is a blessing for us. And the reason that we can get our heads around this story is because we, as human beings, understand how stories work. It's inherent in who we are. We all have stories of who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. We have stories that we believe about how the world works, how we got here, the way different people and different groups interact. We have stories that we tell about those things. And we can actually tell stories in a very particular pattern. There's a pattern for storytelling, and so I want to take you through that. And in order to take you through the storytelling pattern, I need you to think of your favourite story. What is your favourite story? It could be anything. It could be a movie. It could be a TV show. What is your favourite story? And I want you to think about if your story fits into this pattern of storytelling. It goes like this. There's the setting. So usually we start by setting the scene. Where are we? Who are we? When are we? So for example, if you see on a screen outer space with words scrolling backwards, you know what you're about to get. Hopefully some of you know what I'm talking about. So we start by setting the scene. Then some kind of conflict is introduced. A problem that needs to be solved. Something is not right and needs to be fixed. A question needs to be answered. Something needs to be overcome. And then things get worse. Much, much worse. A problem intensifies, the conflict grows, all sorts of people are impacted. Often it looks like the bad guy is going to win, or that if we're talking a romantic comedy, that the guy and girl will just never get together. There's always a wrong solution or a wrong question asked. And then things get so bad and so messy and so complicated that you think nothing could ever fix the problem. But we get to the climax and the conflict begins to unravel. Perhaps the key figure in the story starts to ask the right question and they find the solution to the problem. But then that's not the end of the story. We want to know, how does this work out in the lives of the characters? How are the characters going to live now that the climax has come, now that the problem has been solved? What is it going to look like in their lives? And then we head towards the end of the story. So how did your story go? Did your story fit the pattern? Most stories do, not all of them. Sometimes story writers, authors, script writers like to mess with the pattern, and you will know when you're watching a movie if they have done that, because it will not fit the categories of anything that you were expecting. There is a universal way that we tell stories, and the amazing news for us is we understand this, even if you haven't done English at school for a long time. When you sit down and read a book or when you watch a movie, you know what's happening, you know what's coming. And the Bible actually fits into this same storytelling pattern. There is a setting of the scene, there's a central conflict that's introduced. Things get very, very messy in the Bible, probably the messiest and most complicated story of all time. There is an amazing climax in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the rest of the biblical narrative is the resolution and the outworking of it. So despite the fact that the Bible is long and it is complicated and there are lots of interweaving micro stories as part of the grand narrative of the Bible, we actually have a framework with which to understand the biblical narrative. So I think there's a picture, I might get you guys to put that up if you can. There it is. So it's probably a little bit small for you, but this is out of, again, the Drama of Scripture by Bartholomew and Goheen, and they talk about the Bible as this 6-act play. So you get creation, rebellion, which is with the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. You get promise, which is the story of the Old Testament. You get redemption, which is the story of Jesus. Mission, the story of the church. And renewal, what is going to happen when Jesus comes back again. So I want to give you a very brief overview of each of these, and then I want to tell you a little bit about Act 1, or creation. So Act 1, creation, we'll do a quick sweep and then we'll do a deep dive into Act 1. So this is the setting of the scene. Creation is just the first 2 chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2, and they do a lot of things. They're really important for the setting up of our story. The key things that they do are introduce us to the setting of the narrative, which is Earth, initially in the Garden of Eden, but earth as it spreads out. And it introduces us to the main characters. Now, this shouldn't be a major surprise to anyone, but God is the central character of the biblical narrative. And surprisingly, he invites humans to be part of his story, creates humans, and he also invites creation to be part of his story. And so a summary for Act 1 of the biblical narrative, you might summarize it like this: God sovereignly creates the universe and creates humanity to be in relationship with himself. But then we get to Act 2, the Great Rebellion, where we find the central conflict or crisis introduced to the story. And I said all great stories are driven by some kind of crisis. In a romantic comedy, it's will the guy and the girl ever get together? Or in a sci-fi, it's will the planet be saved before the meteor comes in and hits it? In the biblical narrative, it's no different. It is driven by an essential problem that's introduced in Act 2, which is although God has created humanity and has created them to be in relationship with himself, they turn their back on God and go their own way, and that has wide-ranging consequences. So a summary for Act 2, humans turn their back on God and go their own way. And then we get to Act 3, the promise. Act 3 is where the story gets really messy and complicated, and I said before, the Bible is probably the messiest and most complicated of all times. If you've ever tried reading through the Old Testament, you'll know what I'm talking about. So Act 3 is the bulk of the story, and in any good movie, this is the major part of the drama. So Act 3 is where the drama takes place. And in the Bible, this is basically the whole Old Testament from Genesis 12 through to Malachi. It's the end of our New Testament, end of our Old Testament in our English Bibles. But basically, Act 3 tells us God's initial steps to deal with sin and brokenness that have come into the world in the rebellion. And it begins with the calling of Abraham and the nation of Israel, and then God continues to give promises to his people of how he's going to restore all things. It's definitely not a straightforward story. There are a lot of questions that I still ask about things that go on in the Old Testament, but it is a really helpful way to see the narrative, to see this is the place where the drama takes place. We then get to Act 4, which is the redemption. This is the turning point or the climax in the story, and this is the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where we get the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection to turn everything around. He doesn't just come to die on the cross for my personal salvation. He literally came to change the world. His death and resurrection has turned everything upside down, and that is the climax of the story. And I get caught up in his salvation work, and that is such a blessing. We get to Act 5, mission. This is the resolution of the story. And in most good stories, we want to know, what difference does this make in the lives of the characters? How is this going to work out? How is the fact that Jesus has come and changed the world and completely and utterly turned everything upside down, how is that going to work out in the lives of the people that are following him? And the cool thing is that this is the part of the story that we come into. Act 5 started around the time of Jesus' death and resurrection and is still going on 2,000 years later. And the most beautiful thing in this story is that it is ongoing and that we are invited to be a part of it. What a blessing it is that God would invite us into his story. And so Act 5 is our act. And then Act 6, renewal, is the last two chapters of the Bible, Revelation 21 and 22. And I'm looking forward to, in a coming session, getting to teach on that. But Act 6 is the story of the whole of creation being renewed and restored and being set right. And so a summary for Act 6, God's plan is to renew and restore all he has created, and everything will be put to rights. So that's a overview of the entire biblical narrative. It's a way of telling the story that helps us locate where smaller stories sit and what is going on in God's big plan of redemption. But this morning I want to give a quick overview of Act 1, Act 1 creation. Now we spent about an hour and a half on this and I'm going to try and do it in 5 minutes, so we'll see how we go. One thing I do want to say is, to preface this, there has been a lot of controversy around Genesis 1 and 2 over the years. There are so many debates about, is it a literal 6-day creation? Is it a nothing more than a pre-scientific community of people who knew nothing of modern science? And I want us to park all of our questions about exactly how creation took place and allow the text to address the questions that it seeks to address. And there are two bigger questions that the text is asking, and that is the who and the why. The biblical narrative is really concerned with who. Who is God and who are we and why? Why did God create and why did he create in the way that he did? So one of the most amazing questions that you can ask of any part of the Bible is, what does this tell me about the kind of God that God is? Who is God and what does this tell me about him? And so there are quite a number of things from the creation accounts that we can learn about who God is. He is a creative God. He is a God who was able to imagine all that we see and speak some words and it came into being. He's a speaking God. When you play hide and seek as a kid, maybe you weren't so good at it and you eventually spoke and made yourself known, but when you play hide and seek, you keep quiet. The times that you would speak would be to reveal yourself. And so God is a God who seeks to reveal himself to us. He's a God who speaks. We worship an all-powerful creator God who wants to be known to us, and that is unbelievable. He's a God who is engaged in all that he has made, and he is a God of order and purpose. God brings order and purpose out of chaos. Nothing is left to chance with God. He knows what he's doing. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does the creation account tell us about God? And I would say all of those things and many more, that he is all-powerful, that he is creative, that he wants to be known by us. So that's God as one of the main characters, but we also get to find out some things about who we are as humans out of this story. And the sorts of things that we get to discover is that humans are valued by God, that he places value and worth on people. The biblical narrative, and particularly the passage we heard from Genesis 1, tells us that humans were created in God's image. Now, there were lots of people in the ancient world created in God's image, and they were usually kings of other nations. So you would have the Pharaoh as the Egyptian king, you would have the Sumerian king, you would have all of these different nations around. And the kings were always the image of God and no one else. And Genesis comes along and says, no, all people are created in the image of God. All people have dignity and value and worth because they have been created by God. Another thing that stands out to me from the biblical narrative is that God provides for Adam and Eve. He provides for the humans. God doesn't have to do that. God is an all-powerful creator. He could have created the humans to be his slaves, and yet he provides for them. He puts himself in the place of servant. He comes to the people and provides for their daily needs, which is mind-blowing that God would do that. He also invites them into his rest. Now, God is the one who's created everything. He spends the 6 days of creation doing his thing, creating the wonders of the world that we now live in. And he sits back and he delights in all that he has made. He doesn't have to invite the humans into that rest with him and into that delight. They've done nothing to contribute to the creation. And yet God says, I value you so much that I'm actually going to invite you into the delight and into the rest of all that I have made. And I just think that's a stunning thing. So it's only humans who bear God's image. It's only humans who are said to be valued by God, and I think that's pretty incredible. And the one other thing that stands out to me from the Genesis account is that we are created to be in relationship. God is a relational God, and he has established us as humans to be relational beings. And there are 4 key relationships that God establishes in the garden. The first is a relationship with himself. So humans, Adam and Eve, are set in relationship with God. God is said to be walking in the garden with them. He is close and he is intimate with them. But the humans are also set in relationship with one another. So Adam and Eve are set in a healthy, right, whole relationship with one another. The humans are also set in relationship with creation. They're called to steward and to tend to the earth. And so there is some kind of interesting back and forth relationship between humans and creation, whereas they care for creation, it provides for their needs. And so there's a reciprocal relationship there. And then the slightly more odd one, and it does make sense as you start thinking about the biblical narrative, but the humans are set in right relationship with themselves. We each have a relationship with ourselves, the way we see ourselves, the thoughts we think about ourselves. And in the garden, the humans have a holistic, healthy self-image. And we're not going to get there today, but what we do see in the rebellion is that all four of those relationships break down when Adam and Eve turn their backs on God. So the relationship between God and humans breaks down. The relationship between humans breaks down, and Adam and Eve start blaming each other for what happened. The relationship between humans and creation breaks down because God says the earth is now going to require you to labour really hard to produce. And then the self-image of the humans breaks down and shame enters into the story. And so these four relationships are central to the biblical narrative. They're at the heart of what God is doing, and they're at the heart of what the restoration of the story is going to be about. So a few of the things we talked about yesterday. I want to finish on this point though. There is another purpose of Genesis 1 and 2. Maybe language that's familiar to you. Lutherans tend to have doxologies in their worship services. And it's the idea of Genesis 1 and 2 as being a doxology. Doxology means a word of praise. So it's the idea that Genesis 1 and 2 were written to elicit a response from us, written to call us into the praise and the worship of the God that it is talking about. And it's really amazing that actually Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 both give us a different image of who God is and call us into a different kind of praise of him. So Genesis 1, lots of people have noticed, is really structured and orderly, and also really there's a lot of repetition. And you find that kind of structure and order and repetition in poetry and in music. So you see things like there was evening and there was morning the first day, there was evening and morning the second day, there was evening and morning the third day, and you get all of this beautiful repetition. And so some people have suggested that perhaps Genesis 1 actually started out its life as a psalm, as part of Israel's prayer book. But however it began, its final form is a clear invitation to praise the God who is so powerful and so mighty and so creative that he was able to speak a few words and everything came into being. And so you're not meant to read Genesis 1 and come to the end of it and think, now I know everything I need to know about how the world came into being. You're meant to come to the end of Genesis 1 and fall on your knees in worship of a God who is so powerful and so mighty and so amazing. But interestingly, Genesis 2 actually gives us another picture of God. It's not ordered, it's not structured, it's not the same kind of repetition that you see in Genesis 1. Genesis 2 paints a picture of a garden that you want to be a part of. It tells you about the trees and all the different things in it, and you get to imagine yourself as part of the story. And in Genesis 2, God comes close. He breathes the breath of life into the humans. He walks with them in the garden, and he's in close personal relationship with him. It's a relational invitation. And so you get to the end of Genesis 2, and it's still an invitation to praise, but maybe not so much a fall on your face kind of awe worship. It's an embrace. You're invited into a loving embrace of a God who is so powerful and yet would step down into his creation to walk with them, to embrace them, to later in the story to participate and take on the suffering of humanity. And so we worship a God who is both sovereign and powerful and creative and almighty, and we want to give him all of the glory and the honour for all he has done. But we also worship a God who comes close, who sits with us in our doubt and in our pain and in our suffering, who delights with us and celebrates with us when things are going well. And so that's the invitation of Genesis 1 and 2 for us. And so I'm going to pray, and then we're actually going to invite the band to lead us in a time of worshipping that great God. So would you pray with me? Father, you are amazing. The fact that you have given us these words, that we can know who you are, that you're the kind of God who wants to reveal yourself to us and make yourself known. And so we are so thankful that you have made yourself known to us, that we can be in a close, loving relationship with you, that you walk with us, that you guide us, that you are there for us through the joys and the struggles in life. As we continue to engage with your word, I pray that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear the things that you have to say to us from it. It can be confusing, it can be complicated, but I pray that you would help us sit in the awe and the joy of the fact that you make yourself known and that you have spoken to us and that we have your word. So we're so thankful for all of who you are, the things that you do for us and the way that you are with us through it all. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen.